Hey everybody, it was Arkham here. Figured I'd talk today. While you kind of enjoy a view of the storm right there, sometimes I've been doing audio broadcasts here, but nice storm outside, so I figure I'll film that while I talk about the history of Europe, the elite families in Europe, and how they basically try to change with the times and industrialization, and how it has led to the globalism of today, which we're all pretty much fighting against. These days, it is pretty much national versus globalist. And while we have been arguing over all this ideology and everything, left and right and everything, the reality is it is pretty much national versus globalist. And the major entities who work for the globalist interests and those of us, again, fighting for sovereignty and national sovereignty in the respect and non interventionism of each place. So, back in the 1800s, we started to, in the early 1800s, after the fall of Napoleon, the nations of Europe naturally kind of nationalized, somewhat along ethnic lines, but not completely, more regional and along languages, etc. Now, even Ben Franklin at the time, in the late 1700s, he harnessed lightning, as you see right here in technology. Kind of a nice segue into this, but even he envisioned a future where we would have horseless carriages, in other words, automobiles. So they knew that the tech revolution was coming. There were many, many scientific advancements at that time. Um, Great men like, even before that, leading up to it, Isaac Newton, Anton van Leeuwenhoek, whether it be their inventions or their scientific discoveries and quantifications of it and everything, led to all the advancements we have today. Now, for many, many centuries, out of the Dark Ages through the Middle Ages, Europe had to rely on European nobility. With the lack of technology, lack of communication and traveling, the average person never really traveled, perhaps more than a dozen miles from their home, unless there was a war going on like the Crusades or something like that. So again, they had to rely on the nobles, and they could pretty easily rule as tyrants, and as long as they were benevolent tyrants to some extent, the people fairly tolerated it. Now, the people, though, were not very ethnically tied to their own people. The nobles, the elitist families of Europe, they intermarried amongst each other between nations, and they almost formed kind of like the caste system in India, their own ethnic group. So, with the rise of industry in the 1800s and technology, they knew that they would not be needed anymore. Their existence and their need in society was threatened. So, in America, with the growth of the Industrial Revolution, really, in reality, it didn't have to be done the way it was done. Rockefeller, who basically made himself and his family American nobility, they intermarried with these European banking families. They established a central bank, the Federal Reserve, here in the United States, just like they were doing in Europe. And they have funded and fueled and created every major war, every major conflict, World War I, World War II, fueled the increase of interest, kept people in debt, etc. While again, we have enjoyed unparalleled growth, we have also been kept many ways contained by these elitist families. It's how people like George Soros was able to crash the English pound and then make all his money without even being anything contributive to society or productive to society, and then dictating how society is being run. Again, these elitist families are tied in with central banks, with the establishment of the central banks, like the Rockefellers helped here. Now, of course, people like the Rockefellers were major captains of industry. They were at first very productive to society, but even the way they did it, documentarians, especially, or mostly on the left, try to portray it as, oh, these were evil capitalist free market barons. In reality, it was not capitalism. It was a very controlled, government controlled monopoly, and they worked in tandem with the government. But then they worked with these elite families, they intermarried with these banking families in order to stay relevant, as they would no longer be needed. Why would you still need royalty in Europe? Why, other than tradition, why would you still need these major families? So again, they have pretty much always been the power behind the throne, those who fund the power behind the throne. And even today, major politicians in America, you can see how they funnel money through Ukraine. Some major European leaders wouldn't go along with it, like the Tsar of Russia. That's why you had these European bankers. Go ahead and look up who funded the Bolsheviks. It was bankers in London, these banking families. Why would capitalists fund a bunch of communist Bolsheviks? Because it wasn't about ideology, it was about a means to an end. That's why they funded the Bolsheviks. That's why the Tsar and his family were, after the Bolshevik Revolution, millions of Russians, lost their lives. I believe 200 million people through the 20th century lost their lives due to Marxism, and they funded all of this. All because the Russian Tsar apparently wouldn't go along to get along. and they took the lives of he and his entire family, basically, apparently, to send a message to these national leaders who didn't go along. So, again, funding both sides of all these wars. Both wars started, world wars started over all this. Also, these families can maintain relevance. And today, we call it globalism, and it's pretty obvious who's doing what. When you're doing something this big, trying to do away with international control, you can look up the founding of the European Union and where it came from, and the people who funded it, and again, the people who founded it. It was all for this sake of doing away with national sovereignty in the West and in Western countries like America, where we couldn't be overthrown by, cultural revolution, by violent revolution, the way they did in the East with Russia. Well, that's why they invented cultural Marxism and plugged that into our systems. Different presidents, especially like FDR, were majorly on board with this, but then on the right, you have the neocons like George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, the Cheneys. Again, they are especially involved in this more globalist bent. Donald Trump, most definitely, you know, put a, you know, put a hitch in their plans for sure, threw them off. But these days, it's pretty clear. Just like the Dutch farmers are protesting against globalism, their land would be bought up. The Russia and Ukraine war will disrupt their exports to the Middle East and Africa. It may not create a food crisis here in the West, but it will create a food crisis in the third world where we ship this food to. And then they would have to move vast amounts of those people claiming a refugee crisis to the Western countries and flood our countries, just like they're doing now across the southern border. Again, in all the places from the Middle East to North Africa that were destabilized in the first place, the whole point being to move mass amounts of people around like chess pieces on a board from their native lands, disrupting local cultures and local peoples, and disrupting the advanced Western civilizations in order to gain control. Because again, these elitists have been basically an ethnicity unto themselves, intermarrying for centuries, and have fought to maintain control. When you can't control an advanced society, you have to change the people, you have to change the society. That is why it is national versus global. This is Ozark Gilman. Y'all have a good one.